Russia's Pacific and Baltic Fleet Marines were built to storm enemy coastlines, to fight their way inland from water, under fire, against hardened beach positions. On May 29, 2026, they died in Ukrainian mud, in trenches they had barely had time to dig, destroyed by paratroopers that Russia's entire intelligence network had failed to locate. That defeat pushed the total liberated since February past 630 square kilometers and put the land corridor Moscow built to keep Crimea alive under direct Ukrainian fire for the first time in this conflict. The alarm bells had been ringing in Moscow since winter. As Ukrainian forces began quiet repositioning across the Dnipropetrovsk-Zaporizhzhia borderline in January and February 2026, the Russian command understood what was at stake. The Oleksandrivka axis, the confluence of three regions and the open terrain gateway to the road networks that supply Russia's occupied south, was not an obscure corner of the map. It was the hinge on a door the Kremlin could not afford to let open. Lose control of this junction, and the geometric logic of Russia's entire southern defense begins to unravel from the inside. Moscow responded by reaching for its most capable remaining formations. Russia's 120th Guards Naval Infantry Division, Baltic Fleet Marines headquartered in Baltisk, bearing battle honors stretching back to the Second World War, specifically built and trained for amphibious assault against fortified coastlines, was stripped from the Dobropilia axis and ordered south. Behind them came the 40th Naval Infantry Brigade and the 55th Guards Naval Infantry Division, both Pacific Fleet formations, pulled away from their pressure operations near Huliaipol and Pokrovsk. These were not reserves scraped from mobilization centers or storm units assembled from prisons. They were among the most elite infantry formations the Russian army could move in 72 hours. Marines built for the sea, condemned by a chronic manpower shortage to fight in Ukrainian mud and frost. Specialists denied the one environment they had spent careers preparing for. Moscow had no better hand to play. It was not enough. Ukraine's air assault forces had been preparing since January under a discipline that bordered on obsession. The 95th Air Assault Brigade arrived in its sector under an operational blackout so complete that, according to accounts from within the unit, fewer than 10 people out of a formation exceeding 2,000 soldiers had been briefed 2 weeks before the assault. Electronic emissions from the sector were silenced. No radio chatter, no logistical movement patterns, no drone signatures for Russian intelligence to track. For every sensor system Moscow had trained on that stretch of front, the 95th simply did not exist. Into that engineered silence, it prepared to strike. Night after night, thermal camera drones traced invisible lines above Russian positions, logging sentry rotation times to the minute, mapping command post locations, identifying where armored vehicles had been staged beneath tree canopies in the hope that foliage cover would hide them from satellite passes. Engineer teams slipped into the Russian minefield belt hours before the assault, silent, methodical, cutting lanes through obstacles and wire without triggering a single alert. No detonations, no signals, no disturbance. Just corridors that Russian defenders would never know existed until infantry came through them at speed. The fog arrived with the morning of the operation, thick, complete. Russian reconnaissance drones climbed into zero visibility. The sky belonged to Ukraine. Assault teams moved in packets of 10 to 30 fighters, dispersed, fast, specifically sized to evade the area fire concentrations that Russian artillery had calibrated to destroy larger formations. These were not soldiers charging a prepared line. They were hunters moving through a mapped killing ground where every Russian position had already been accounted for. First-person view kamikaze drones, small, cheap, and impossible to intercept in saturation, hit Russian command posts before line units registered the breach. Screens went dark. Drone operators died before they could log a contact report. The Baltic Fleet Division's battalion commanders lost contact with their companies within minutes. The communication web that transforms individual trench positions into a coherent defensive line simply ceased to function. Units that could not communicate could not coordinate. Units that could not coordinate could not defend. Then the artillery opened. Precision-guided Excalibur rounds, American-made 155mm shells that Russian electronic warfare systems have periodically degraded elsewhere on this front, arrived here integrated with drone-corrected targeting networks that closed whatever jamming tried to open. They began finding Russian armored vehicles one by one beneath the tree lines. Standard howitzers pounded the pre-registered trench networks in deliberate sequence. Every position had been designated by weeks of aerial reconnaissance. There was no guesswork. The fire was systematic. It was merciless. It did not stop. Ukrainian infantry fighting vehicles poured through the opened minefield corridors. Machine guns covered the flanks. Paratroopers moved through smoke and fog with night vision equipment, clearing trench after trench with the mechanical precision that comes only from months of preparation. The Baltic Fleet's Marines, elite soldiers fighting in a role they were not built for, holding a line they had barely had time to fortify, could not form a coherent response. The positions thinned. The line broke. Within days, 46 square kilometers had been swept clean. The villages of Novoselivka, Sichneva, Pidubna, Tovste, Novokatsk, and Zeleny High passed from Russian occupation to Ukrainian control. In basements, Ukrainian paratroopers found enormous ammunition stockpiles, shells, rockets, and drone components that the Russian army had been accumulating for the summer offensive that was now permanently cancelled. Those caches were seized intact and transferred directly into Ukraine's inventory, replenishing the ammunition that had been spent taking them. The paratroopers did not celebrate. They fortified. Anti-tank missiles were positioned immediately, covering the most predictable axes of Russian armored counterattack. Heavy machine guns went in at the perimeter. Javelin anti-armor systems faced the open ground. New trench lines were cut and hardened against rocket fire within hours of the last position being cleared. At night, the large multi-rotor bomber drones that Ukrainian soldiers call Baba Yagas seeded Russian logistics routes with anti-tank mines, blocking every road that any armored counterattack would need to travel. The doctrine was applied with complete discipline: take ground, hold ground, deny the enemy the ability to regroup and return. That operation did not occur in isolation. It landed on top of a campaign that had been building since February 2026. The month Ukrainian forces first exploited a catastrophic collapse in Russian battlefield communications triggered by restrictions placed on Starlink terminals that Russian units had been using in violation of SpaceX's policy. When those terminals went offline, entire Russian battalion command networks lost their coordination backbone at once. The 95th Air Assault Brigade, alongside the 82nd Air Assault Brigade, operating across the broader sector under the command of Major General Ole Apostol, the same officer who had personally led the 95th in an earlier phase and whose tactical philosophy now governed the entire air assault force, moved through that blinded structure and began reclaiming terrain. By May the 22nd, the total liberated across the Oleksandrivka direction had reached approximately 590 square kilometers. Deep State, the Ukrainian open-source mapping project that has documented every confirmed frontline change since 2022, confirmed the May the 29th gains in real time, logging the newly cleared areas around Novoselivka and the contested villages of Zeleny High and surrounding hamlets. The combined total surpassed 636 square kilometers. Additional advances in the days immediately following pushed the figure further. For the first time since the full-scale invasion began, almost the entire territory of Dnipropetrovsk Oblast had been cleared of Russian forces. The Kremlin had wagered its best remaining southern formations on holding this ground. That wager had been called. Russia had lost. But what does Russia actually lose when the most capable formations it could move collapse in a sector they were never meant to defend? And what does their absence mean for every other front they abandoned to get here? Every Marine killed on the Oleksandrivka axis was a soldier removed from somewhere else. To reinforce the collapsing south, Moscow stripped battalions from Pokrovsk and Dobropilya, the precise directions where Russian offensive pressure had been building through late 2025 and early 2026. The 40th Naval Infantry Brigade, pulled from the Huliaipol sector, had been part of the force Moscow intended to push towards Zaporizhzhia city. That push is now suspended indefinitely. The Baltic Fleet Division no longer functions as a coherent fighting formation. It has been consumed in the trenches it was forced to hold. The gap this creates is not abstract. The Pokrovsk offensive, which had consumed enormous Russian resources across months of grinding Donetsk fighting, has visibly slowed. The pressure that was supposed to anchor Moscow's 2026 summer campaign in the east is blunted by the absence of the formations that were redirected south to die in someone else's emergency. The Kremlin borrowed from the north to pay a debt in the south. The debt is still growing. Russia cannot replace these losses at the rate it is generating them. In March 2026 alone, Ukraine's armed forces logged 35,351 Russian casualties, killed and wounded, the highest single-month total since the invasion began. Drones caused 96% of those kills. The first 4 months of 2026 cost the Russian army just under 130,000 killed and wounded combined, with March and April alone removing more than 70,000 soldiers from the battlefield. By late May, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky placed the 2026 cumulative total at 145,000. The numbers are staggering. They are also confirmed. Recruitment is failing to keep pace. The numbers are brutal. Moscow had targeted approximately 400,000 new contract soldiers for 2026, roughly 1,100 per day. Current enlistment runs at approximately 940 men per day, short of the break-even threshold with monthly attrition. Western officials told Bloomberg in February that Russian losses had exceeded new monthly recruitment for 3 consecutive months, a trend that raises the prospect of a forced mass mobilization, something the Kremlin has spent 4 years trying to avoid. About 40% of new recruits are now drawn from vulnerable populations. Prisoners, debtors, men facing criminal prosecution offered contracts in lieu of trial. These are not replacements for decorated Marine veterans or precision-trained paratroopers. They are raw material fed into a machine that kills faster than it can be restocked. The cost of each meter gained reveals the depth of the crisis. In April 2026, Russian forces captured 53 square kilometers in the Donetsk region while suffering 25,000 casualties on the same axis. That is 470 Russian soldiers per square kilometer of Ukrainian ground captured. At that exchange rate, territorial gains are not a path to victory. They are a path to the accelerating exhaustion of the force itself. North Korean reinforcements were supposed to ease this arithmetic. Of approximately 11,000 deployed, Western intelligence agencies and open-source analysts estimate that as many as 6,000 have already been killed or wounded, figures that carry significant uncertainty, but whose lowest readings still describe a casualty rate reflecting the brutal reality of fighting in a drone-dominated theater with unfamiliar equipment, through a language barrier, against an enemy that spent months mapping every approach route before a single shot was fired. The stopgap has not stopped the bleeding. While the army bleeds, the artery is burning. The land corridor to Crimea, the road network running from Rostov-on-Don through Mariupol, Berdyansk and Melitopol, Russia's overland supply backbone for the entire southern theater, is under systematic fire. Ukrainian military intelligence has placed sections of the Berdyansk-Melitopol-Jankoy highway under direct fire control. Fuel tankers are burning on that road. Military transport trucks are being struck at distances of 160 to 200 kilometers from the front line, ranges that were not available to Ukrainian drone operators a year ago. The Institute for the Study of War documented geolocated footage of at least 35 Russian military vehicles destroyed along the southern highway network in a single month of spring 2026. Ukrainian domestically produced attack drones are reaching Mariupol's outskirts and turning cargo convoys into wreckage on open highway. The Kerch Bridge, Russia's physical umbilical cord across the strait to Crimea, has been struck multiple times and partially repaired. It is functional, but never fully secure. The land corridor was designed as the redundant backbone, the supply system that would keep the peninsula alive if the bridge came down. That redundancy is burning at multiple points simultaneously. Russian engineers are building. Dragon's teeth barriers are rising across northern approaches. Anti-drone installations are being positioned along the corridor's length, but the network runs hundreds of kilometers through exposed terrain, and Ukraine's medium-range drone force is multiplying faster than static defenses can cover the distances. The Institute for the Study of War's tracking of net territorial change tells the story in a single statistic. Between January and late May 2026, Russia achieved a net gain of 104 square kilometers across all of Ukraine. In the same period of 2025, Russia had seized over 1,600 square kilometers. That is a 94% reduction in Moscow's rate of advance, achieved while the Russian army was still supposed to be building toward a summer offensive, still supposed to be winning. The strategic initiative in southern Ukraine has shifted, measurably, durably, and possibly permanently. If Russia cannot reverse this with the formations it has already burned through, what options genuinely remain, and how does each of them lead somewhere more dangerous than the one before? The most immediate Russian response is already visible and already failing. More battalions are being pushed south. Units drawn from Russia's eastern military district are being redirected from Donetsk, assembled into an improvised defensive line in front of the collapsing sector, and ordered to hold at any cost. The structural problem is inescapable. Every battalion redirected south is a battalion no longer contributing pressure in the north. Ukrainian forces on the Kupiansk and Lyman axes have noticed the thinning. The Pokrovsk push has slowed. The Kostiantynivka axis is achieving marginal results. Moscow is playing a zero-sum game on a board where every square matters, with a hand that can no longer cover every position at once. Then, should any patchwork hold the immediate breach, Ukraine's operational doctrine enters its next phase. Since February, the pattern has been consistent. Take ground, fortify within hours, absorb the counterattack, advance again. Applied further south, toward Tokmak, the logistical hub of Russia's entire southern theater, that pattern would place Ukrainian ground forces within direct artillery range of the Berdyansk-Melitopol corridor. Not drone range, not mid-range strike range, howitzer range, 40 kilometers. At that point, every Russian supply convoy attempting that highway would be operating under direct fire from precision artillery that can be repositioned faster than any static defense can respond to it. But that is only the beginning of where this chain leads. Once Ukrainian artillery reaches that range, the pressure cascades across every axis simultaneously. Russian forces on the Kherson left bank begin rationing. Formations in central Zaporizhzhia slow their rotation cycles. Reserve units cannot move safely on roads under observed artillery fire. The command structure tries to compensate by routing supplies through alternative corridors, but those corridors are already under Ukrainian drone pressure from systems operating at 160 to 200 kilometers. The southern grouping begins consuming its own pre-positioned stockpiles to stay functional, because those stockpiles can no longer be reliably replenished. The army does not collapse all at once, it hollows from within. And if that fails to stabilize the front, if the logistics failure deepens and lines begin thinning beyond the point where even desperate repositioning can hold them, Moscow confronts the decision it has deferred since September 2022. Full mobilization, not the partial draft of autumn 2022 that sent 300,000 men from the provinces in months, not the steady intake of prisoners and debtors, not the North Korean stopgap battalions sent to die in a theater they do not understand. A call-up on a scale that reaches into Russian cities, into middle-class apartment blocks in Moscow and St. Petersburg, into families of engineers and teachers and professionals who have been carefully insulated from the visible cost of this war by state media and geographic distance. The Kremlin has built its domestic political survival on avoiding precisely this moment. Every Ukrainian advance brings that moment closer. Even further down that path, mobilization may not solve the fundamental problem, it may simply expand it. More Russian soldiers arriving into a theater defined by drone saturation, precision artillery, and the systematic destruction of logistics infrastructure will not face the conditions of February 2022. The first-person view kamikaze drones that killed 96% of Russian casualties in March 2026 will still be flying over every approach route. The Excalibur rounds, the thermal reconnaissance systems, the drone-corrected targeting networks that located and dismantled the Baltic Fleet's marines before they could organize a coherent defense, all of it will still be operational. Undertrained conscripts fed into a kill zone that has been calibrated over 4 years to destroy exactly this kind of force may simply add more wreckage to the fields and more names to Ukraine's casualty tallies without changing the geometry of the front. At the far end of this chain, the destination toward which every step has been building, stands Crimea itself, Russia's Black Sea Fleet headquarters, naval aviation facilities, a permanent military garrison of tens of thousands, the administrative structure of a peninsula that Moscow has spent 12 years integrating into its legal and economic framework, and the symbolic weight of the event that defined Vladimir Putin's political mythology, the 2014 annexation that remade his historical identity and launched the chain of decisions that produced this war. Crimea is not a strategic interest. For the Kremlin, it is the foundation of everything that followed. The Kerch Bridge has been struck and repaired. It is vulnerable. It was always vulnerable. The land corridor was the redundant artery that was supposed to guarantee the peninsula's survival regardless of what happened to the bridge. That corridor is burning. Fuel tankers explode on the Melitopol highway. Military transport is being destroyed near Mariupol by drones operating at ranges that were impossible in 2023. Ukrainian military intelligence has placed sections of the Berdyansk-Melitopol-Jankoy highway under fire control and released the footage of burning vehicles to document it. The corridor is not yet severed. Roads cannot be permanently closed by drone strikes alone, but it is degrading. Every Ukrainian kilometer gained to the south narrows the distance between the advancing paratroopers and the roads that Russia cannot function without. Russian engineers are pouring concrete across the northern Crimean approaches. Dragon's teeth are being laid in rows across the flattest ground. Anti-drone batteries are positioned at intervals along the corridor's most exposed sections. The defensive architecture is real, and it is being built with a speed and urgency that reflects genuine fear inside the Russian command. But the 95th Air Assault Brigade and the formations supporting it are advancing, patient, methodical, taking ground that is immediately hardened and held, step by step, sector by sector, each assault more precisely calibrated than the last, and neither the concrete barriers nor the dragon's teeth have stopped the advance yet. And into this deteriorating picture, on June the 4th, 2026, came something Moscow did not anticipate: an open letter from President Zelensky to Putin, proposing an immediate ceasefire along the current front line and direct bilateral talks in a third country. The Kremlin did not respond, but the offer, extended from a position of mounting military advantage, not desperation, reframed Moscow's dilemma entirely. The cost of refusing to negotiate is now measured not just in soldiers, it is measured in corridors, supply routes, and time that Russia no longer has in abundance. The realities on the ground have deviated completely from Moscow's strategic goals, and on the table in the Kremlin there is reportedly not a single commander willing to say out loud what the maps already show. Can Moscow construct a new and durable defensive line in the south before its supply routes are consumed by fire, or has that window already closed without anyone in the Kremlin admitting it? If the advance toward Tokmak continues on its current trajectory, does Putin choose the internal fracture of full mobilization or accept the external collapse of the southern front, knowing that both paths lead somewhere he cannot control and neither leads back to the strategic position Russia held in January? But the question that carries the most weight, the one whose answer will shape not just the outcome of this war but the security architecture of the European continent for a generation ahead, is this: if the land corridor to Crimea falls within direct reach of Ukrainian ground forces, does Vladimir Putin accept the strategic reality and negotiate from a position of weakness, or does he reach for something far more dangerous than conventional war, something that cannot be walked back, something that changes everything that comes after, something no one on either side of the front line is prepared for? That answer has not yet arrived. So, in your view, is the Kremlin still capable of reversing what is unfolding on the southern front? And when this moment is studied in the years ahead, which side will history say held the initiative, and which side simply ran out of time?